However, there is something festive that we have to do, something quite informal, and I wanted to ask you if any one of you has seen Ruben Lifuka today. Oh, he's here, and it is his birthday today. So what we will do is we will clap and do a big congratulations to Mr. Ruben Lifuka. Thank you so much. You don't have to make a birthday speech, but now every time you bump into someone, they will say happy birthday. So you will have heard this 2,000 times. So congratulations once again. We will start the plenary in just a minute. I will just remind you that since we are starting because of the speeches, we are starting a little later. We will finish a little later as well, so lunch will be later too. We will finish the plenary at around 12:20, 12:30. I can see that the panelists are getting ready and they're about to come on stage very soon. I do remind you of some logistical details, for example, the app. If you haven't downloaded it, do so and make your own agenda there, network with your colleagues, and thank you for attending this session really actively, and thank you for being here with us. So we welcome you, those of you who are in Vilnius for the first time today, and I hope that you did enjoy yesterday, which was full of content and full of emotions as well. So we are really happy to have you with us, and we will discuss defending the defenders, the plenary number 2, our call, our last frontier. And this is a panel discussion that will be moderated by Hazel Feigenblatt, who is Programs Director for Latin America at the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. And this is the moment where I invite her on stage, and I will ask you to give her a big hand. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here. We are going to have what I think is a very important conversation about defending the defenders. And I can invite my panelists to please come on stage. We heard yesterday in the opening plenary about how some international agreements are being ignored. The rule of law is under attack in many countries. And still, we have many defenders who are still working hard, exposing corruption at enormous risk to their lives. And so that's why it's so important that we have this discussion. So we have an excellent lineup, almost entirely complete on a stage. So I think I'm going to start just introducing them. And I think we have only one more to come. So we have on the stage in this moment State Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Norway, Bjørg Sandkjær. We have also Carolina Jiménez, President of the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA. We have also Pia Ranada. She is Rappler's Head of Community and a June Knight Fellowship, Journalism Fellow, 22-23. We have the United Nations Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defender, Mary Lawlor. And last but not least, and I think getting the microphone on over there, we have Ketakandriana Rafitoson. She's the Vice Chair of Transparency International. Please take a seat. Thank you so much for being here. Before we get started and go right to the discussion, we are going to watch a video about Dr. Gubad Ibadoghlu. He is an anti-corruption defender and a political prisoner in Azerbaijan. His case emphasizes why it is so important that we are here today and that we discuss what else can we be doing to protect defenders. So without any further ado, I think we can watch
Unfortunately,
the video.
I'm not with you today because my mom is hospitalized a couple of days ago as a result of the attack she received from the Azerbaijani police in Baku. Last summer when my dad, Dr Gubad Ibadoghlu, and my mom was visiting Baku, they were attacked by police, their car were crashed, and they were physically dragged and assaulted. As a result, my dad was kept 9 months in detention center. He was kept there without any access to drinkable water, medication, and proper food. My dad, Dr Gubad Ibadoghlu, has been investigating corruption in Basel and in Azerbaijan for really long years. He's been investigating grand corruption and the oligarch governance kleptocracy, particularly focusing on shadow economy, stolen asset recovery, and he's been tracking stolen assets around the world. Particularly in last years, he has been investigating corruption in Basel and in Nagorno-Karabakh territory as well. Now he's suffering from the deplorable, very bad heart condition and he needs an urgent surgery abroad. However, he's kept hostage in Azerbaijan. The charges are still on and he has a travel ban, and if sentenced, he will face 17 years of imprisonment for being a corruption fighter. Every single day, when my father's case is brought up, and when he is defended and remembered by international community, saves his life and helps us to get him out of the country as soon as possible. And I kindly ask all of you to help my father and to save my father and to help our family. Please bring out his case with the government officials, with journalists, with your NGO, with civil society, even with your family members. It's very important to bring up his case and also to focus on his work and also his health. And I'm as a child of this family that has been targeted by the government, I'm asking you your help. And thank you a lot for listening to me.
The case of Dr. Ibadoghlu, I think, puts perfectly a human face to the discussion that we are about to have. So maybe we can start with Secretary Sandkjær. And maybe, can you tell us a little bit about how Norway works with journalists, civil society who work on anti-corruption? How do you protect them? And have you felt a need to change some of your approaches in view of the context that we've had in the last few years?
No, thank you very much, and thank you for putting this very important question on the agenda as we are here in Vilnius this week. First of all, I think Norway would like to say we view human rights defenders as resources, not as a threat. As a government, we take the starting point of looking at normative frameworks, so we remind ourselves that we have obligations under different human rights conventions, under the UN Convention Against Corruption, and that we need to make sure that we address when these conventions and these obligations that all governments have are being violated. And that's the framework that we look at this within. To do that, we need to work together with different organizations, and we do support organizations of journalists, for example, the International Consortium for Investigative Journalism, the ICJ. I think it was a very powerful statement we heard in the film of how important this is. We also work with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which exposes corruption and financial crime and trains investigative journalists, in particular on illicit financial flows in parts of the world. Last year, we were very happy to be able to provide some significant support to the Pulitzer Center to strengthen independent journalism. So really working with these key actors, non-governmental actors, actors within the media, to strengthen the kind of accountability that journalism can provide is one way that we work as Norway. Of course, we also work with civil society, very important partners, to be able to address and put the tribulations, the challenges of human rights defenders on the agenda. And finally, as governments, there are also things we can do to support human rights defenders. So to support through our embassies, we can interact directly with human rights defenders in various countries, and we do that. And there are also programs such as Student at Risk and other programs that can provide some respite for human rights defenders in difficult situations, bring them to Norway or bring them to other contexts for shorter or longer periods of time, just to be able to sometimes just get a very much needed rest. I think I don't need to tell anyone in this room that being a human rights defender is at the threat of life and mental health is something that we also need to recognize and see what we can do to support. So I think I'll stop there, just with the normative framework that we work within, and really emphasizing the importance of working with various partners within media, civil society, academia as well, bringing us that knowledge that we need to be able to work together to address this. Thanks.
Thank you. Ketakandriana, I'm very curious to hear from you about what Transparency International is seeing through all its chapters around the world in terms of how the current, more complicated context is affecting defenders. In particular, what would you say is working in terms of protections and what isn't working? Maybe with things changing, we have to change the strategies as well.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and very happy to be here. So, since the last IACC, I would say that the attacks against anti-corruption campaigners through our chapters and beyond our chapters all over the world have tremendously increased, unfortunately. And you have just heard the story about Dr. Ibadoghlu in Azerbaijan. This is not an isolated case. And our chapter in Brazil, for instance, since the beginning of this year, is facing legal action from the government, just for, criticizing the backsliding of the rule of law in Brazil, but also on false allegations from the government. So this is one case. Another case is in our chapter in Georgia, as you know, are facing also smear campaign and attacks just because they are standing against this, what they call the Russian law, the foreign agent law that the country wants to adopt, and that it is a real threat for democracy. So these are cases across Africa. You also have people struggling when fighting against corruption and blowing the whistle against cases of corruption, mostly linked to government actions. Last year, you had the murder of Thulani Maseko, who was a human rights defender, as you know, but also an anti-corruption activist. So this is a global trend. But I would say what is working is international collaboration, of course, between NGOs, like-minded NGOs, helping us within Transparency International to protect those who are threatened. What is working is also the cooperation with international organizations and institutions. We have relayed in some countries on the help of major embassies from the north, for instance, for helping, for calling actions, for releasing our activists. And this is really something meaningful. But what we would like to see is also a global commitment for the protection of whistleblowers and anti-corruption activists, because we still feel that this is missing in the global debate. During the COSP10, UNCAC COSP10 in Atlanta last December, we have emphasized this need, of a better implementation of Article 13 of the UNCAC Convention and also Article 5, because the two really implies and require the full participation of civil society in state life, in public life, including in anti-corruption. But the protection leg is missing, I would say. So there is a need for us to emphasize this and to enhance all the legal mechanism protecting whistleblowers. And these have to go also on a national level, because a number of our chapters have been advocating for the adoption of national protection laws towards human rights defenders, including investigative journalists and anti-corruption activists. But most of the time, governments are reluctant for doing so. This is not a priority for them. But all the priorities that we will have defined during this conference will be in vain if we don't protect those who fight actively on the ground every day against corruption. So today I would like to ask us to take concrete actions. We are asking you to endorse a resolution, a motion that we will be presenting right after this plenary for stopping all harassment and all threats and attacks against anti-corruption activists, including Dr. Gubad Ibadoghlu. So I count on you to take that concrete step today. Thank you.
Thank you. Amitabh, next question is for you. With your experience and Oxfam's experience, would you say that anti-corruption activists working in the environmental field face different unique conditions and dangers? And if so, what is the case, and what do you think needs to happen to try to tackle that?
So thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. But let me start by reminding all of us of Berta Cáceres, an environmental activist from Honduras. She was brutally killed a few years ago. And she was a well-known, internationally acclaimed activist. She had won the Green Nobel, but still she was brutally killed because she was fighting against a construction of a dam and a corruption there. And this is not unique to Honduras or Latin America. In fact, very recently, one of the most celebrated public intellectuals of the world, I would say, Arundhati Roy, in my country, in India, now the government has given permission to have case against her under terrorism laws. So that's what is happening at the moment. So if you really look at, in fact, the HRD Memorial Report says that 1/3 of the people, human rights defenders killed, are environmental defenders. What essentially we are seeing at the moment is a direct battle between people who are defending the right to land, water, forest, Mother Earth on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have corporate greed. And we know what this corporate greed is doing. And everybody know, we are seeing the disaster of carbon emissions, deforestation, and what it is doing to the environment. So at this juncture, it really becomes critical for us to recognize this battle. And when these environmental activists, human rights defenders are fighting this battle becomes a systemic battle. Because it's not just against petty corruption. It is actually against really the nexus between very often corporate interests, which is pretty much, we are selling out the planet to these corporate interests. But there's a nexus between these corporate interests, the political class, and the criminal elements. So that's the battle that is being waged at the moment. And what do the environmental rights defenders, indigenous rights defenders face? Defamation, false cases, violence, and at times even killing. So that's really the reality that we are seeing. So it's really critical now that we recognize this massive battle. If we need to fight corruption, we need to recognize that this is a systemic corruption, and we need to fight by ensuring that these human rights defenders, indigenous rights defenders, environmental defenders are pretty much at the forefront. But let me also say, as in let's not get over-romantic and say only community protest can help us save the planet or ensure human rights fight against corruption. It has to be a much broader, alliance of everybody coming together. We need to recognize the frontline role of these defenders, but also ensure that there's enough protection for these human rights defenders. And let me just say that, in particular, women human rights defenders are at particular risk. And we have seen the data. Very often, sexual violence is often used a mechanism to silence women human rights defenders. So at this juncture, I think it's really critical. What can be done? I would say that it has to be an international coalition. Everybody has a role. Civil society needs to ensure that the voices of these human rights defenders are not only heard at the national, regional level, but also at the international level. We need an alliance, an international alliance, to fight this systemic corruption. I would say corporates can also do many things. And as Oxfam, we've been working with corporates to ensure that there is free, prior, informed consent. They ensure that in their entire supply chains, there's due diligence on human and environmental rights. So this is really a moment. I would say that we are really fighting a battle between defending the rights of Mother Earth, people's right over land, water, forest, their livelihood, their identity on the one hand, and on the other hand, the nexus of corporate, state, and criminal mafia.
Thank you. Carolina, Amitabh was just mentioning one of those cases in Latin America that you're very familiar with. Latin America has continued to see democratic backsliding, and also is, has some of the countries where it is the most dangerous to be a journalist and an activist, including in the environment. At the same time, we have seen some positive developments. For example, the election in Guatemala. In Washington, 18 months ago, in this panel, you mentioned the case of a prosecutor who was imprisoned, and she's now been freed. And so how can we leverage these windows of opportunity to regain ground when it comes to protections? And how do you mobilize civil society that sometimes can have a hard time coming together, which sometimes the trans-ideological authoritarianisms that operate in the region, to call them somehow, don't have that problem. They seem to work together just fine. What are your thoughts on that?
No, thank you. It feels great to be back. And as somebody born and raised in tropical lands, I welcome the rain, and I join the chorus of those people happy that this conference took place in June and not in December. But I'm very happy to be having this panel again, because there is no such a thing as anti-corruption fight, human rights world, or journalism without human rights defenders, without anti-corruption activists, and without the journalists. So, in short, we need to defend the people. We need to defend the defenders, the journalists, the anti-corruption activists. And this is becoming much more harder to do because we are seeing, unfortunately, an increase in authoritarianism. And we know, not just in Latin America, because basically there is no region now that is an exception. Europe certainly isn't. The more ground authoritarian leaders gain politically, economically, socially, the more ground anti-corruption activists, human rights defenders, and journalists lose. So the fight against corruption is, or the fight for human rights is also a fight for democracy and a fight against authoritarianism. And in Latin America, unfortunately, we see, increased criminalization. This is, if you investigate corruption or you investigate human rights violations, unfortunately, you may end up being investigated. And in the worst case scenario, criminally prosecuted, which leads you to exile or to prison. And we have plenty of examples of journalists and human rights defenders in jail these days. But we also see targeted violence, which is really extreme. you were talking about environmental and land defenders. Of course, it's not an exclusive problem of Latin America, but if you look at the Global Weakness Report, in 2022, 177 land and environmental defenders were killed. Almost 9 in 10 happened in Latin America. So it is overwhelming. And as you were saying, the struggle, to come up with solutions is difficult. We see a region where there are more authoritarians, and authoritarians collaborate and cooperate with each other effectively. They're well articulated globally, as we know. Think of Vladimir Putin for 1 second. Think of his global allies. Think of his global allies in the global north. And think of the political spectrum to which they belong. Then think of his allies in Latin America. And think of the political spectrum to which they belong. So authoritarians are, very pragmatic when it comes to cooperation. I think for us, human rights defenders and members of civil society, I hear the word alliance, I hear the word cooperation among us. I think we need to go even farther. We need to build or strengthen a community of practice to, first of all, not just learn from each other and share a strategy, but also to help each other with early alerts and to accumulate knowledge that can be passed on to different groups and people working in different fields. If there is one thing that the Guatemalan election taught us, is that we need to be ready to take or seize the opportunity when we see a crack on the wall. Because no matter how authoritarian and how close civic space is, there is always a crack on the wall. And sometimes it takes years, sometimes it happens suddenly, but we need to be ready to seize that opportunity.
Thank you. Pia, you come from Rappler in the Philippines. It's one of the independent news outlets that has faced some of the most extreme forms of persecution, I think. And in addition to that, you're, like many media outlets around the world, facing a crisis in terms of business models and reaching the audience. Still, you have managed to not just survive, but also thrive with different, ways to monetize some of your knowledge and know-how, and also engage with the government officials and the community. Tell us how you have managed to do this, and to what extent do you think it is possible to replicate in other similar contexts?
Thank you, Hazel, for that question. And I'm really, I'm really happy to be in this panel. I'm really honored to be on the stage with you. First, a backgrounder. So at the height of the Rodrigo Duterte administration, our CEO, Maria Ressa, faced 12 legal cases. I was then covering the presidential beat. I was barred from being in any venue near the president. We were also we figured in this coup plot. We were accused of being part of a coup plot against the government, along with human rights activists and other media organizations. It was a time when the biggest TV network in the Philippines lost its franchise. There was major red tagging, disinformation networks were on overdrive, and there was just a lot going on for media and human rights activists during the Duterte administration, when there was an ongoing drug war that targeted many low-income households and lawyer groups and human rights groups. So that was a context we were operating in, and as you can imagine, a lot of our advertisers pulled out. And you would know that newsrooms, that's one of our business models, right? Advertising is a key revenue stream. We lost like 50%. And then you add to that the legal fees that we had to spend because Maria Ressa was facing 12 legal cases. It was $1 million for 1 year alone that we had to pay in legal fees. So you can imagine, managers in our newsroom had to take voluntary salary cuts to pay for the legal fees. Our operations were shrunk, and this affected our journalism. And so that's the context we were operating in. So what do we do? As a journalist organization, where do we get the money to keep surviving? So what we did, crisis turned into opportunity. We leaned into our strength, which was investigative journalism. We actually developed tools that we had used to investigate the propaganda machine of the government, and we realized we could actually monetize this tool, and we created a spin-off company that used our investigative skills to do research that was paid for by institutes, even corporations. It was kind of like a sister company, but we couldn't, at the time, we had to hide the connection because it was still, we didn't want that new company to be targeted by the government. But that new company enabled us to survive during the worst of the Duterte years. And now it is a thriving company. We're getting a lot of work and funding to do research on things like harassment, tracking, for example, online attacks against female journalists in Latin America. We are getting these opportunities because of that crisis that we had leveraged our skills as journalists to support the work we do. So I think the lesson we learned here is that, number one, crisis can strengthen your community, but only if you reach out to your community soon enough and kind of not be paralyzed by a crisis, but think what your strengths are and how your community can actually benefit from that and how that galvanizes your community. Second is we actually leaned into pockets of trust, because we don't think, even in a hostile environment, a repressive regime, you will still find commonalities with specific people and groups. And you can actually lean into this for strength. So during elections, for example, we led a coalition, Facts First PH coalition, that got together 150 civil society groups, human rights activists, church groups, because they're a very powerful force in the Philippines, legal groups, so lawyers groups. We got us all under one umbrella to basically fight malign actors who would red tag both journalists and human rights activists. We would together make fact checks. So civil society groups would alert us that, there's this information going around in our communities. Can the newsrooms please fact check it? And we were not the only newsroom in that coalition. There were many organizations from TV, radio, digital news outfits who were in the same coalition as us. And we would then create fact checks which the civil society groups would spread online. And then our partnerships in academia, so we also partnered with universities, they would actually do research that would bolster our findings in this information. And so this created a kind of network of trust that we used against the propaganda machine of the government. So it was really kind of coming together. And then I think the kind of cherry on top was whenever there were smear campaigns against both human rights activists and journalists in that coalition, the legal groups in that coalition would provide pro bono legal assistance to the journalists and the human rights activists. We actually filed an administrative case against a government official for accusing human rights activists of being communist rebels and planning to oust the government. And she got that complaint. It was an ethics complaint that got her out. So those are the kinds of examples of I think journalists have this misconception that because we report on communities, we have to be in this ivory tower and kind of look down from above and be separate from everyone. But I think that is where we are weakest. We are vulnerable when we think of ourselves that way. I think the better way to do it is to see ourselves as part of the community and to really lean into these ties, these trusts, these bonds. And that is the best way to protect not just journalists, but everyone in civil society. So I think that was the best learning there. And but I think one thing that I would just like to flag, in all of this, is that is not the only threat we're seeing now. I think the biggest threat to digital news specifically, all over the world, not just the Philippines, is big tech. It's really algorithms, it's AI. Because if you notice, right, big tech platforms have deprioritized news posts on Facebook. So if you look at your Facebook feed, most likely a news organization's Facebook posts are not reaching you anymore. And part of this is because of election season, right? It's an election super year, but it's also even more important that news organizations are able to reach audiences precisely because we fact check. We're the ones who are supposed to protect people from disinformation networks and propaganda. But because we are deprioritized, no one can really read our news anymore. Second is the Google AI summaries, AI overviews, which are now being rolled out globally in different parts of the world. These decisions of big tech platforms actually harm digital newsrooms because now we are not able to reach people because they now just rely on the AI summaries. They don't click into our websites, and this really affects our operations, because now if no one's reading our journalism, what impact can we really make? And so we really need the help of everyone, civil society groups, any think tanks or institutions out there who could support journalists to break the barrier and reach people so that we can really do the service of protecting people from propaganda or disinformation networks, especially in a crucial year as election years in so many countries.
Absolutely. Thank you. We are very lucky to have here today the special rapporteur, who not only is the special rapporteur, but also has dedicated her career to protecting defenders. I'm curious to know what your assessment is of the current situation of protections for defenders, and where do you place that? How do you contrast it to what we have seen in the last half century of protections?
Hello, everybody, and thank you all for having me. I really would like to start with a quote by Václav Havel, because when I see you all there and I listen to Pia, I'm reminded that hope and solidarity are the driving forces of the human rights movement. And Václav Havel said, hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. I have never been in favor of the constant narrative that every year is the worst year for human rights defenders, situation is getting worse, civic space is shrinking, the environment is not supportive. And though many of these statements are true, we need to put it in context. The human rights movement and human rights defenders, in particular, have weathered incredibly difficult challenges over the last decades. And when you mix power, self-interest, and corruption, it's easy to see how human rights violations will always be with us. When I started in the mid-70s, much of the world looked very bleak. Mass murderers ruled in Cambodia, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iraq, Uganda, and other countries. Backed by Washington, Pinochet took power in Chile. There were military dictatorships all over Latin America, Brazil, Guatemala, Uruguay, and elsewhere. And human rights violations were very much hidden from the public eye, and that can't happen anymore. The good side, I know there are very bad sides, but the good side of social media is that you can now get information in real time on violations that are happening. And of course, it is true that some places are much worse than the 70s. But thanks to human rights defenders and civil society, many are much better. Military dictatorships in Latin America have been replaced with democracies, even though I fully accept there are huge problems there. Apartheid is over. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Women human rights defenders and LGBTI defenders, their situation has improved in many places. And we just saw lately the EU directive on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence coming in. So you can see steps. I mean, progress is being made, albeit slowly. So I really don't think we should focus only on the negative trends impacting human rights defenders, but we should rather change the narrative and highlight how human rights defenders contribute to building civil and just society through their crucial work in promoting democracy and the rule of law, working against injustice in all its forms, and pressing for accountability for human rights violations. We have countless of examples of successes of human rights defenders around the world who have succeeded in changing laws, in protecting the vulnerable, and holding businesses to account. And I don't think we should forget that. I believe that human rights defenders are agents of social change, and sadly, repression is a measure of their effectiveness. And of course, as previously, human rights defenders continue to be imprisoned, attacked online and offline, killed particularly, as you said, in the context of land, environment, and indigenous rights. Now to your question, are we going forward or backward? I think on a number of issues we're going forward. First of all, there are more people working for the rights of others than ever before. There are over 10 million non-governmental organizations in the world. And there are huge numbers of young people getting involved. Indeed, in Kenya, over 80% of those attached to NGOs are under 24. There is a growing and complex human rights machinery at the international level. We see the impact of the Universal Periodic Review process. We see the growth in special procedure mandates in the last decade, and the broadening scope and competency of the treaty bodies. And all this would have been unimaginable in 1993. There are, of course, new and very worrying trends. One is the stigmatization and demonization of human rights defenders by leading politicians or by the introduction of foreign agents law, which are supposed to be giving transparency, but stigmatize activists as foreign agents, terrorists, and enemies of the state. Another related concern is the increased legal and judicial tightening of civic space through the introduction of increasingly restrictive NGO laws, for example, in the context of protests or climate change. Criminalization, often resulting in lengthy prison sentences, is, of course, an ongoing deterrence tactic. And slap lawsuits are paralyzing small grassroots NGOs and human rights defenders and bog them down in fighting these instead of being able to focus on their core substantive work. And one of the things I've been appalled by over the last few years is the criminalization of solidarity. It used to be a good thing to help people, and now we are seeing that human rights defenders working for the rights of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are charged with being people smugglers, traffickers, and even sometimes spies. As the main focus of the conference is anti-corruption, I'd like to say that anti-corruption activists and whistleblowers are human rights defenders in the context of my mandate and are a priority for me. I wrote a thematic report to the Human Rights Council on this issue, and I'd like to thank Andrea Rocca of Transparency International for helping us with this. Anti-corruption work is central to human rights, and those who undertake it should be acknowledged and protected, and their work should be recognized. And some activists, such as investigative journalists, are more likely to be acknowledged as human rights defenders, although for others, much of their work goes largely unnoticed. And when it comes to whistleblowers, motivated by human rights concerns who make public the issues of bribery, graft, or petty or grand corruption, they are often at grave risk. And we see the devastating impact of the practices of business enterprises on human rights defenders, and the importance of whistleblowers who expose such practices, often at great personal risk. And similarly, lawyers exposing corruption, health workers exposing harmful pricing and medical practices, academics exposing corrupt practices at universities, and they are very often not only under-recognized, but vilified and prosecuted. And finally, I just think it cannot be said often enough, and we heard it throughout yesterday, it is really, and Pia, you said it today, it is really so important to build alliances and networks. You can find in the most unlikely places somebody who can help you, if you are willing to be open-minded about building alliances and networks. And many human rights defenders tell me that it is their networks and their community that they go to for protection. And change is always collective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to have now a space for a little bit of just discussion around two, I think, important issues. Then we're going to have a space for questions from the audience. The first question will be for Amitabh, Secretary and the Rapporteur, and it has to do with standards. When we have difficult contexts, there's always a discussion about, do we need updated standards because we have new challenges, including technology that Pia was mentioning. At the same time, there is a risk, right? We have a lot of anti-rights movements, populist governments who have important power, and so that opens a risk. Like, are we going to end up with worse standards if we open that door? What are your thoughts on that? Amitabh, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. And can I just thank Mary for the optimism that you bring into the conversation. Thank you. I think that's really critical. But let me also remind us, this is not to take away the optimism, but this is the moment where we have seen more than 10,000 children get killed in Gaza. There is forced starvation happening in Gaza at the moment. Yeah. I think there is a fundamental shift happening in terms of the normative framework which acknowledged human rights, as in the post-war consensus around UDHR is at the moment being really, it is fragile. So I would really say that shift of the normative framework is something we need to really focus on, and we need to revive that. Just coming back to your question, I would very strongly say that let's not be timid or scared because of this moment of authoritarianism. This is the responsibility of civil society to find the crack that you're talking of and really build that movement for defending human rights, protecting and deepening human rights. And let me say that there are examples, as in coming again from Latin America, my colleagues tell me who've been working on this first legally binding agreement, the Escazú. So that's remarkable, that we now have an internationally binding regulation which recognizes the defenders' right to information, participation, and justice. So there are possibilities that even in this context, we can make progress. But let me also say that while we can achieve some of these international mechanisms, it's ultimately the responsibility of the states to deliver these mechanisms. And again, we are seeing with Escazú that it is not being ratified by several countries. So you do need, again, going back to Mary, what we need is serious, continued, sustained pressure on regimes to hold them accountable, to ensuring that human rights are delivered to everyone. And in that, I think we must also recognize at least an entity like Oxfam, that we are not going to be the leaders, it's the human rights defenders who are going to be the leaders. They need to be at the center of drafting these mechanisms, but we need a much broader rainbow coalition of journalists, of academics, of civil society, of trade unions who are going to now defend the real ideal of a democratic and peaceful society.
Wonderful. Secretary Sandkjær, you are sitting between the two sides. Where are you on the issue?
Sorry, I didn't.
Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Where are you on the issue of standards? Do we need to revise standards now? Is it a good time? It's not?
It's an interesting question, because on the one hand, we do have important standards that we are fighting to uphold. And on the one hand, we could think that we should achieve what we have set ourselves before we move on to set ourselves other standards. But we are faced with new challenges, and we need to figure out how to address them. So I would like to continue a little bit on the optimistic note of my neighbor here.
I feel in trouble.
No, but in terms of the normative frameworks that where I started, I think it is important that we uphold faith in the multilateral systems, in the normative frameworks that we have agreed on. We have them there. We have human rights frameworks. We have mechanisms to hold countries to account. And we have those alliances to expose where human rights are being violated, and to make that information available and to protect those, or try to protect those who suffer because of it. But because we are faced with new challenges, we do need to think about discussions around, for example, we heard about the opportunities but also challenges from artificial intelligence, from new technology. There are discussions, how do we deal with this? There may be interesting issues to look into there. In the face of rising authoritarianism, which you mentioned, I think I get back to this, the world is changing. We need to preserve and strengthen the standards and normative frameworks that we have, the mechanisms that we have, the alliances that we have. We need to form new alliances to uphold them, but at the same time make sure that we keep the discussions alive to address new contexts and new challenges that were not in the minds of those who wrote these normative frameworks even 20 years ago when the United Nations Convention Against Corruption was adopted. I think that's the best answer I can give you at this time.
Thank you.
Yeah, so, first of all, optimistic or, pessimistic point of view. Let's just be realistic. The data that we have gathered through the CPI of last year, 2023, the Corruption Perceptions Index, shows that, there is not enough effort against corruption delivered around the world. We are stagnating, and this is a fact in the last decade, because 2/3 of the countries, of the 180 countries that we surveyed, still score below 50 on the 100 rank of CPI. At the same time, the attacks against civil society are growing around the world, as shown by the Civicus Monitor 2022. So this is a reality. And the priority now for us, I would say, is to enhance, as explained beforehand, the protection of anti-corruption campaigners. But we also need to put a focus on the absolute need for defending better the civic space around the world, offline and online. Because, as expressed by the UNGAS 2021 political declaration, we all have the right, to fight against corruption and to, defend our liberties and freedom without any kind of reprisal, offline or online. So now today, as you explained, there are multiple attacks which are happening on offline and online as well, especially. Online platforms such as social media can be a good tool for defenders and anti-corruption activists, but at the same time, they represent a threat. So what is needed in our sense is first to really teach whistleblowers and also activists how to blow the whistle against corruption safely online. And we have to develop such tools for accompanying them in order to decrease the potential attacks that they may face. Some organizations are already specialized in that. We are trying to do that through our ALACs within Transparency Internationals. And this is really something that has to become a global trend. How to pacify, how to securize those online platforms. Second thing is also to find a way to avoid the surveillance which is made through those social platforms, because those tools are used by governments most of the time to spy out against activists and whistleblowers. In Madagascar, for instance, our government has bought the Predator software, which is forbidden in most of European countries, but which someone in France sold to our president. So I would like to encourage also a strengthening of regulations around those softwares, because these are lethal weapons against anti-corruption activists. This is the change that we need to bring right now. You have mentioned beforehand the danger constituted by AI development, but there are tools or platforms which may look, like safe, such as Facebook and others, like used by billions of people around the globe, who are also very harmful for activists. So, you know, the legal protection is crucial, but a revolution in the regulations related to technology is also key. And at the same time, the empowerment of our coalitions, but also of all the defenders around the world is crucial. They need to know what are the risks they are facing to better protect them. So we here in this room can all act on that point, I think.
Thank you. I think this has very organically taken us to the second question we had, which, and this may be for Pia and Carolina. In the topic of technology, we are seeing with the social media platforms, artificial intelligence, spyware of many different types that are creating opportunities on the one hand, but also entirely new battlegrounds. We hear complaints very often about civil society leaders who have to focus half their time on just fighting that instead of the mission, for example. And you were saying as well how some of this technology can take important businesses out of business, basically. To what extent do you feel like, at least in your experience, civil society is adapting to fight back? And this is a constantly changing landscape as well. So it's, you know, we're only seeing, I guess, the surface at this point. But what are your thoughts on what's coming next? How well prepared are we? And what can be done? Who should be leading the discussion on this?
I definitely think we're not prepared. Like, civil society journalists are not prepared for what's coming because the traditional threats are still there. For example, I mean, impunity, murdering journalists is still happening all the time. In the Philippines, like just a few months ago, a radio broadcaster was killed while he was broadcasting his show in his house. And then a few months before that, another radio broadcaster was killed for reporting on an oil spill. And the shipping company that was responsible. So you have these traditional threats, and then you add the tech, big tech. I mean, you know, the AI, the tech from social media, where already journalists are being there are deep fakes of journalists. So it will only be a matter of time before these bad actors start contracting AI groups, you know, who have agenda to pay them to make deep fakes of human activists, and then use that as a reason to arrest them. So these human rights activists and journalists, a lot of them don't even understand AI and what the technology can do. And then by the time they are taught, upskilled to understand AI and the deepfake tools out there, the various tools that can target them, by the time they start implementing it, the technology has already outpaced what they had been trained on. So I think that the responsibility is for the big tech platforms, number one, to subject themselves to regulation. I think that's one thing. And of course, the other side of that coin is for governments to pursue that regulation, consult civil society on how we can implement regulation that is fair, that doesn't exclude anyone, but also puts the necessary guardrails on big tech platforms who really are becoming distributor of news and information, but by and large, they are not held accountable for that power.
Thank you. I think, first of all, it's hard to think of adaptation, right? When you think about such a fast, high-speed, ever-evolving landscape in the digital world. I think in the same way that there is political authoritarianism, there is digital authoritarianism. And human rights defenders and anti-corruption activists, are victims of digital repression. But in the same way it poses immense risks, it also poses immense possibilities. So understanding how platforms, AI, etc., evolve is something that we need to integrate more into our work. And I think there are clear gaps. I think I really appreciate also the rapporteur's, narrative about hope and the importance of hope in our work. It's true, I speak mainly about Latin America. We don't have the dictatorships of the 70s, but I don't think authoritarians need them anymore,
right? I mean, that's the technological change has led us to this. I mean, in El Salvador, the president was re-elected against his own constitution, right, after putting 2% of the adult population in prison. Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela is running for his third term, although there is an open investigation for crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court. And, I don't know, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua has closed over 3,500 NGO and academic institutions. I mean, Daniel Ortega made the Boy Scouts illegal in Nicaragua. It's just things that you never hear about anywhere else. You see at a small country in Central America doing it. And yet, there is resistance in the most precarious situations. And the digital landscape helps us with that resistance. Because if you take the Nicaraguan example, basically all of civil society and all of independent journalism is living in exile. You find very few defenders inside Nicaragua these days. But those inside Nicaragua are well connected with those in exile. And it is within that network that they resist, you know, this very heavy and cruel authoritarianism their society face. And they do this in alliance with many other Latin American groups. But I do want to close by saying, you know, we cannot do this alone. Beyond political will and solidarity, human rights defenders, anti-corruption activists, independent journalists need international cooperation. And by this I mean financial aid. There are too many crises and limited resources, and we're very well aware of this. But if, you know, the international community is serious about defending the defenders, then it also needs to continue expressing their political will, but also translating that political will into effective international cooperation.
Thank you. Anybody else has thoughts on that?
Well, I have so many thoughts, but first of all, just one of the things I talk to governments all the time. And one of the things I hear from governments is that human rights defenders shouldn't be a protected category. And I say they should be treated the same way as everyone else. And that's why I'm trying to shift the narrative a little bit to the right to defend human rights. That's just one thing. And I totally agree with you about Latin America. Look, I'm not rosy. There's a huge attack on the international order at the moment, very serious, and that's why I don't think we should mess with the standards at the moment. I don't think we'd even get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights again. So I just think we have to be really careful to pick the moment when there is a moment, and if there is a moment, to strengthen the standards. But meanwhile, to really just keep, you know, it's all about persisting, resisting, and continuing. And just keep at it, you know, until something clicks and something happens that brings about some kind of positive change. You were saying also about the Escazú. Like, I've just come back from a country visit into Brazil, and one of the recommendations I made to them was Escazú, because they're having the COP next year. And now I've been told they'll do it, but whether they will or won't, we'll see, you know. But it's not just human rights, it's not just NGOs and non-governmental organizations of all shades that need to push for the ratification of the Escazú. It needs to be other states as well. Embassies on the ground really need to be involved. Because, you know, it takes, I kind of see like NGOs, human rights defenders, anti-corruption activists, they gather information, they mobilize on the ground, they transmit the information to the international community. And for someone like me, my job as a rapporteur is to try and bring their voice to those governments that wouldn't normally see them, and to try and mobilize states to act in their defence. And Norway supports the mandate. I'm very happy. But they also are in what I call a contact group of states that are willing to take action once a month on human rights defenders. I send a case. So, you know, and we've seen some good results from that. So we need to all be looking at, you know, mapping the whole landscape and seeing who can we get everywhere to, you know, to try and improve the situation for human rights defenders. And then, you know, implementing. Since the mandate on human rights defenders was started in 2001, one of the recommendations in every single report has been ending impunity. Impunity is still as much with us as it ever was. You know, so there are many things in the current standards that, if they were implemented, you know, would make a huge difference to human rights defenders. If there were laws and policies and participation by human rights defenders, and I include anti-corruption activists in designing policies and in designing protection mechanisms, and if the protection mechanisms were more open to, for example, anti-corruption defenders, and also the human rights community. Because the reason I did the report on corruption was to try and bring it into bring anti-corruption defenders into the kind of the basket of human rights defenders, is because very often you find that a lot of human rights NGOs, they look at, and not only NGOs, but people look at anti-corruption activists as out there somewhere. You know, they're doing good work, but they're not thought of as protecting human rights. So, and then the Financial Action Task Force, they need to review their implementation of international standards by states and ensure that they're not used to impede the work of anti-corruption defenders. And I also think that any of the bodies that are working against corruption need to monitor the situation of human rights defenders working on these issues, and also to support them when they are being attacked and retaliated against, because it's a job for everyone. I think that's really, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, my point is just to, you know, invite all of the members of the international community, donors and partners, those who invest in the fight against corruption, to invest more for the protection of anti-corruption activists, whistleblowers, and also for supporting more civil society engaged in this. Because, once again, more of the time, CSOs, especially from the grassroots perspective, nationally, they have the feeling, the powerless feeling, that they are not making a great contribution to the anti-corruption world when they are facing, you know, reprisal, heightened harassment and everything. They feel alone sometimes. And so now is the time for us to really increase the sanctions against those governments who perpetrate violations against human rights, but especially against anti-corruption whistleblowers and activists. Because the whole world now, the drama that we live on a daily basis are all rooted in corruption. As long as we don't get rid of this disease, then all of the investments in development, in democracy, in everything will be wasted. So let's put a priority on anti-corruption and especially the protection of activists. Some donors, you know, and institutions will continue to collaborate with corrupt governments. And this also have to change. You have to stop funding corrupt governments because there are other priorities in which your taxpayers will be happy to help. And the protection of those people who are standing every day against injustice and corruption is something which is worth investing in. So this is just my say. Let's just try to reverse the narrative a little bit, and also the priorities in terms of global funding. Stop funding corrupt government. This is a must need.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. So now we are going to open it up for questions from the audience. I will ask that you please identify yourself to, if the question is for anybody in particular or the entire panel, and to please, just out of respect for everybody else who wants to ask a question, to keep it short. So we're going to take first 3 questions, and then hopefully another round of 3. The gentleman here was first, and then the lady on that side. I think the microphone is coming there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Professor M.T. Ladan from Nigeria. I think the panelists have done justice to the theme of the plenary. Very informative and also, quite loaded in terms of perspectives. My point has to do with the fact that I think we should take the advice of the Special Rapporteur on changing the narrative and also moving forward to devise different strategies. But I would like to just address my last point to the speaker from Philippines, I think. I think beyond relying on network of trust, we are operating within a national context, with a national constitution, with regulatory framework. I think we still need to get some champions drawn from the legislature and from the judiciary if those in the executive are becoming more and more inaccessible because of the tendency for them to clamp down on activists. So we need to recruit champions from the legislature and from the judiciary, because whether we like it or not, we need a national legislation for the protection of human rights defenders, protection of whistleblowers, protection of anti-human rights, anti-corruption defenders, because the legal protection regime within our national context will protect these defenders against victimization, against retaliation, and it will also provide them with an access or the right for them to actually pursue a legal remedy against any government or national institution that is targeting them. So you need national protection beyond the community network of trust. That is my advice. We still need a government. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Then I think yeah.
Thank you so much. More of a comment. Want to remain positive. I think that we need to, as a panel, I think I welcome the opportunity for you to gather and come up with some real tangible solutions. For those of us that are working in vulnerable spaces like Latin America, where I came from, the issue of funding is key. There's a lot that's placed on our shoulders. We have to carry the solutions, but we're not being given the funding, right? So how do we replicate 30 more Norwegian models, right? And I commend your country for doing this, and for going directly and sponsoring some important journalism projects. But how do we move that funding to civil society organizations who are small, who are tight, who have to deal with lawsuits, who have to deal with an AI landscape they don't know? So, I welcome you to please gather after this event next week and come up with some tangible solutions. Because if we don't get funding, we're gone.
Do we have a third question? Over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeff Halleck. I'm a PhD candidate at American University in Washington, D.C. I want to thank the panelists for this great discussion, and especially shout out WOLA, who's been instrumental in a lot of the research that I've done. When we were watching the video at the beginning, it struck me how there's a current situation in Azerbaijan where there are political prisoners, and there's a call for these political prisoners to be released. Yet, in November, delegates from around the world will go to Baku for COP29. And my question is, what message does it send defenders on the front line when international community, states that use the language of rights, then confer legitimacy on states who are working to undermine these very ideals? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Pia, I think the first question was for you, and then any of the panelists who wants to chime in.
Okay, so when we say community, when I spoke of alliances, that actually does include government. So, for example, Rappler, we have a lot of partnerships where we think we're aligned with government. We've had partnerships on disaster preparedness reporting, which is like raising awareness about disaster and climate change in the Philippines, which is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. So we also have like deliberative technology platforms that we actually work with government to measure public sentiment on ordinances or laws that they want to craft. So I think there are many overlaps and many shared values that even journalists, you'd think, oh, you cannot deal with government. We don't think so. We think that there are certain areas where we can collaborate if the goal is awareness raising, information dissemination, helping the public withstand disinformation. We really do value these partnerships. We work with legislators too, like when it comes to decriminalizing libel, which is still criminalized in the Philippines, the freedom of information law, those kinds of issues close to the hearts of journalists and human rights activists. We work closely with legislators to make that conversation unfold. And I think the more we weave these relationships, the harder it is for hostile actors to isolate any one of these groups, journalists, human rights groups, to isolate them and attack them. Because the more we have ties together, the more their alliances are that force these hostile actors to think again before disturbing that network or targeting a specific group in that network because of the strength of these bonds. And I think there is wisdom in building those ties and finding common value to align on.
Thank you. Who would like to address any of the questions?
I would like to talk about funding in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, etc., and civil society, because I think I agree with the point that we need tangible solutions. When you think of certain places, you know that the crises are overwhelming. There is no doubt about that. We have more crises and limited resources, and that's a really hard thing to balance. But I often hear people telling me, well, Latin America is a peace zone. Since the the Colombians signed a peace agreement, there is not an active armed conflict, at least under, the standards of international humanitarian law. And there are, more democracies than, I don't know, in the Middle East. And therefore, we should, move our funding somewhere else. And it's happened. It's happened in the Americas in general. Organizations based in the US are also struggling with getting the financial support they need. And I think there is a fundamental mistake in thinking that if a region of the world, is not facing an armed conflict or has more or less democracies than in other regions, funding should go somewhere else, because then the model is containing crisis and missing the opportunities. And I think in the case of Latin America, you have a few things that constitute real opportunities. First of all, are a strong feminist and youth movement. I mean, few of the positive developments that we have seen in the last few years in terms of rights have been achieved by the feminist and the youth movements. Then you see that even in worst case scenarios, things happen. The concept of stunning elections happen in Latin America, and Guatemala is the best example. A year ago, we never expected we would be seeing a government that is committed to human rights and anti-corruption efforts. Many Guatemalans felt the battle had been lost, and we're in a completely different moment right now. So I think it is important to fund the crisis. It is absolutely necessary, but it's also important to look at some of the opportunities that regions like Latin America have, and support those people fighting to make sure that we seize the opportunities, because we know that we cannot take rights for granted. And we always welcome, the cooperation of European governments and other governments that share our values, but that there needs to be a longer commitment to funding the causes we support.
Thank you.
Thanks. I can follow up on the discussion on funding. I was just reflecting on discussions that are happening globally right now around funding related to the Sustainable Development Goals, development in general, where a lot of the funding for this kind of work comes from. And unfortunately, right now, globally, we are in a situation where this funding is under great pressure.
Exactly.
Because of all the wars that are going on, because of all the different crises related to the climate crisis, to different humanitarian crises, and so on. We see that although donor governments, I'm not going to speak for all of them, but just describe what I see. Although donor governments have stepped up, if you look at the OECD DAX statistics of ODA, development assistance funding, it is increasing. But it's not increasing enough to keep up with all the needs and challenges that we are facing. So I would just like to put that on the table. As Norway, we remain committed to funding. I mentioned a few initiatives around supporting investigative and journalism. We do fund also other organizations that are active in human rights and in supporting human rights defenders, and we are working with other donor countries and colleagues to make sure that we maintain these levels of funding, maybe even increasing them. But I just would like to put that measure of, I don't know, temperance or realism in saying that it is a challenging context right now. Unfortunately, and it shouldn't be like this, but realistically, this funding competes with funding for other very important causes. And so I think maybe as a community, it's something that we could think about together on how we work together to make sure that we do get the necessary funding for important work that's happening on the ground, as well as internationally on this. So we're very supportive, of course, of the work of the Special Rapporteur and others in this room. So I don't have a solution, but I think you've put your finger on a very important topic, that it's something that we should keep discussing. Thank you.
Can I just say that funding has always been an issue for human rights defenders and NGOs. Ever since I started, it was always very, very difficult to get money. And human rights defenders always had difficulty in accessing money. So there's a new report out by the EU, I don't know if you've seen it, that I just looked it up now. It basically says that the funding to human rights defenders and their organizations has stagnated. And it recommends that obviously more funding should be given to human rights defenders, but something that I argued all my life for, core funding, because it's impossible to function in a coherent and effective way if you're just getting project funding and you don't know if you'll have the next project funding. So core funding is very important. And also the management of the funds should be brought much more locally to whoever is doing the work. So I'm hoping a lot of the funders, a lot of the big foundations are looking more at this now. But of course, they're not going to have enough money either, because, as we know, There are more and more NGOs, which is great, but they need more and more money. So, regarding your question about states who proclaim to be very in favour of human rights defenders and yet do nothing, this is sadly a really, how would you put it, common, it's just common. Every time I do my interactive dialogue in the state, in the Human Rights Council or in the General Assembly, that's where states ask me questions. They give a comment and they ask me a question if they have one. And they all say, we support the Special Rapporteur's work, blah, de, blah, de, blah. And they all say, what more can we do? If I hear that question again, I think I'll actually commit harikari. There is no such thing, no offence, Norway. There is no such thing as a government that is driven solely by its human rights principles, because their political and strategic interests get in the way, and they have to be balanced. So it's all about who are your enemies and who are your friends. And trying to get states to take just a consistent human rights approach is really difficult. And I often think, you know, states have thick necks. So they should be able to ask an oppressive state a searching question about a human rights defender in a country that they may be trading with. Stuff like the EU dialogue, you know, on China. For example, I've heard it from diplomats like that they go in with the cases and they go, and then, and by the way. So like it is I find it deeply angering. I find it deeply frustrating and I get very angry because it's just a wall that you just have to keep pushing at. Thanks.
Thank you. And we're actually going to have to wrap it up here, but thank you so much to all of you for your very interesting discussion, and thank you everybody for staying all the way until lunchtime.
Oh. I will ask the panel to stay for 2 more minutes because by request from the very panel and the audience, the IACC has prepared the motion, which I will read now, and apologies that you're watching my back. Motion of the 21st IACC, defending the defenders, the time is now. The criminalization of justice fighters is reaching alarming heights. All over the world, we are witnessing corrupt corporate and political leaders demonizing those who speak up, often calling them criminals and inventing excuses to imprison and torture them, or even worse. From the killing of forest and land defenders to the imprisonment of journalists, human rights and anti-corruption activists in all regions of the world, inaction and even complicity from governments undermine the rule of law. Enormous courage and sacrifice are required in advocating for more democratic, just, and inclusive societies. Gubad Ibadoghlu, an Azerbaijani politician activist and a prominent human rights and environmental defender who is being punished for his activism and investigations on oil and gas revenues, oil-related environmental devastation and corruption. His arrest came almost 1 year ago after he published an article that criticized the country's oil and gas policies. Facing up to 17 years in prison, he and his family have suffered from police brutality. We demand his immediately and unconditionally release. We, the global anti-corruption movement, gathered at the 21st IACC, stand together with him and his family, and we stand with all those who, because of their commitment to justice and transparency, face harassment, violence, or even pay with their lives. We demand immediate and unconditional action from governments all over the world to ensure that journalists, activists, citizens, and all those who defend integrity can live free of fear and persecution. The time to act is now. Resolution adopted during the 21st IACC, Vilnius, Lithuania, 19th of June, 2024. And I invite on stage Chair of IACC Council, Ruben Lefuka, to speak to us and to provide an endorsement.
Thank you very much. At this stage, what we'll be asking from you as members of this IACC gathering is to approve the principle of the resolution. We can do the refining of the words later on, and you could see Roberto. Roberto here can take your submissions. Trust me, I'm from Transparency International. There have been days where we've had meetings where we've spent days just trying to refine resolutions. So we're not going to do wordsmithing here. So if you approve the principle of the resolution, could I receive from you a round of applause for the resolution as presented? So once again, thank you very much, but please, if you have any specific inputs to make, you can approach Roberto. Our idea is to have a final statement, which will be printed out by the last day, but at least we have, in principle, your endorsement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Thank you. And if we understand correctly, the endorsement has been received, so thank you so much for that. Just before you go to lunch, I want to show you a trailer. There is a special movie on defending the defender, which is directly related to this plenary, that will be shown today. Tomorrow, that's at 5 p.m. tomorrow in F40, Theatre 9. You can find all of that information at the information desk on the AV, wherever. The movie is called State of Silence. And let's bear with me to watch a little trailer of this very special movie. Thank you.
I've covered stuff in the past that people told me I should be concerned about.
We're talking thousands and thousands.
Every century is characterized by a key commodity.
And food is a very obvious and central way to wield power.
I thought maybe there might be more to it than that. Turns out there was.
Place offshore, prostitution, paradis fiscaux, trafic de drogue, gestionnaire de fortune, pillage des ressources naturelles. Dans leur quête incessante de nouveaux marchés, les mafieux s'invitent dans les cercles de pouvoir avec un impératif.
Somos esas personas extrañas que mientras toda la gente va corriendo para huir, pues nosotros vamos directo a ver qué está pasando.
Hacíamos la denuncia con las imágenes y lo que escribíamos.
Se encontró el cuerpo sin vida del periodista.
Al matar a un periodista se mata el derecho de la sociedad a estar informada. Hay que decirlo una y otra vez.
Qué triste que lleguemos a este punto, que no podamos hacer nuestra chamba.
Está imponiendo lo que ha llamado zonas silenciadas.
There's been one rule for the elite, especially the elite that's connected to power, and another for everybody else.
Accounts were opened in the name of these low-level, low-wage employees who do not come into the text. Money used to be deposited in those accounts, and finally they used to land in the accounts of either Mr. Hamza Shehbaz Sharif, Mr. Suleiman Shehbaz Sharif, or Mr. Shehbaz Sharif himself.
The world needs to wake up.
Проголосуют Беларусь. У нас Конституция не под женщин.
The man I love was trying to topple a dictator, and then he went to jail for it. So I did what any royal wife would do. I ran in his clothes.
Thank you so much. So again, this movie is screened tomorrow at 5 p.m. in F40 Theatre 9. Thank you for attending it tomorrow. Thank you for the resolution. Thank you for the motion and for the endorsement that shows that this is a conference of action, not just words. And for now, I'll let you off to lunch. Let's come back here at 1:30 on the plenary on greed and corruption, a disease accelerating the global environmental catastrophe. Lunch is, as always, in the lunch area. Do enjoy it, and do come back here in roughly an hour and 5 minutes. Thank you so very much, and see you soon.